2 weeks out.
I've been involved in politics now for 30 years, most of my adult life. And so at this point, I'm not surprised by much and certainly not shocked by much. The level of cynicism, though, coming this morning from the Wall Street Journal editorial page in light of comments that Donald Trump has been making really is shocking. John Meacham, I'm going to go to you and then we'll go through all the details. But the Journal's editorial the day after Donald Trump said that Democrats allied against him are, quote, the enemy from within, on a day after Donald Trump said that January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol was, quote, a beautiful thing, after he said that Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff were, quote, bad people who threatened democracy and were the enemy within. And then Howie Kurtz said, well, will you at least say you're not going to punish or prosecute your political opponents? Trump replied, excuse me? That's what they're doing to me. In a separate Fox News interview on October 13th, Trump said that his foes, quote, could very easily be handled by the National Guard, if really necessary, by the military. He repeated the line about the enemy within days later during a Fox News town hall event. You call Americans who don't support you, quote, the enemy within. And so this morning, I woke up expecting, because there are times that the Wall Street Journal editorial page checks Mr. Trump at his worst instincts. Instead, they talk about the Democrats' fascism meme and say that basically Democrats are the real National Socialists and that what they've done is far worse than anything Donald Trump has done. Joe Biden's loan forgiveness, stop me if you've heard this before, was more law-breaking than anything that Donald Trump has ever done. And in this entire editorial, they failed to mention one time January the 6th. Instead, saying the worst thing that Donald Trump has ever done was when he tried to use money to build a wall that wasn't approved by Congress. I really, again, very rarely am I left without adequate words to explain what's going on here. But I was shocked enough yesterday that Donald Trump continued calling Democrats, quote, the enemy within, which, of course, is a precursor to him getting elected, calling them enemy combatants and being able to lock them up and have military tribunals. And they will dismiss this perhaps, but they've never heard language like this before. And Republicans have been saying all week, oh, no, he doesn't mean that. He's talking about illegal immigrants. And Donald Trump keeps saying, no, I'm not talking about illegal immigrants. I'm talking about Democrats being, quote, the enemy within. Let me say that again. And tell me if you've heard this before by a major party candidate, calling his political opponents, quote, the enemy within. Worse than Putin, worse than Xi, who he says may not be our enemies, worse than Kim Jong-un.
I'm
Domestic
not sure which is
political rivals, the enemy within. And they're calling this a meme, which I don't know, John. I just don't know where that puts us. I really don't know where this puts us as a country, because I've never heard any politician call his opponents the enemy within and say he's going after them.
We've been to this. We haven't been to this particular place in America before, and I don't often say that. It worries me to say that, but if we don't have that recognition, if we don't have, and this is going to sound grand, but if we don't have the moral and imaginative ability and capacity to recognize what is in front of our eyes and what we can hear with our ears, then the central thesis of America, the American Republic, if you want to go back to George Washington's farewell address, was that this republic cannot exist without the moral and religious principle of a people. And leave out the, if you want to, leave out the religious part for a minute, and let's just talk about the moral part. And it's not a sermon, it's not a homily, it's not a Sunday school lesson. It's moral in the sense of, I care about how things are, not just for me, but for other people. It's a pretty baseline thing, right? I'm not even saying you have to make it the most important thing. But if you let the will to power, an innate human drama to try to dominate other people, which is an absolutely fundamental human impulse. The point of the United States was that we were going to manage that impulse. We were actually going to make out of many one. And, you know, Joe, you and I have talked about this before. The Wall Street Journal editorial page is enormously influential among people who think of themselves, and usually are, very accomplished, very often economically successful, conservative Americans. And you and I have joked in the past, you could write, for a lot of people we know, you could put your grocery list in Wall Street Journal font, and they would go, you know, this is really profound. I think Edmund Burke said this about going to the dry cleaners. You know, it has that kind of capacity, that kind of reach. And what worries me to death nearly is either the kinds of Republicans that we know and grew up with either really believe this, they really believe that there's kind of a both sides thing, which is bad enough. And what's even a little worse is they don't really believe it. But because they are not sufficiently troubled by what the former president represents, they're looking for anything they can tell themselves to justify doing something that I think in their hearts they know is wrong.
Yeah. Well, they do. And again, the comparisons, and you've heard it, and I've heard it, people saying, well, January 6th was really not much. And my gosh, did you see what Joe Biden tried to do?
It's insane.
By forgiving student loan debt, which of course
he wants to forgive this,
which of course was turned over, parts of it, by the United States Supreme Court, and Joe Biden didn't have his people attack the Capitol. Again, this right here, not even mentioned in today's quote fascist meme editorial, but yesterday again, the enemy within, the enemy within, the enemy within. We keep hearing it. And who is the left-wing freak, the left-wing radical the Wall Street Journal points to as being the most extreme in her hyperbole? One, Anne Applebaum, who devoted her early life to fighting against the Soviet Union, whose entire life has been dedicated to calling out Soviet Union's evils. When people on the left try to whitewash their evils in the 40s and 50s and beyond. The same Anne Applebaum who continues to try to talk about the challenge of totalitarianism and authoritarianism for the Wall Street Journal editorial. She's the radical leftist. See, doesn't that tell you something? Me, somebody who's far more conservative than Donald Trump, are 99% of the Republicans in Congress. Conservative, by the way, we used to talk about being conservative, like balancing budgets, pushing back against Reagan, pushing back against Russian aggression like Reagan did, like Reagan conservatives, far more conservative than anybody in Congress that I've seen over the past 8 years, far more conservative on those basic structures of what we grew up knowing conservatism is. And Ann Applebaum is the person here called out as being the radical leftist. And it's revealing, isn't it? And here, somebody with a 95% conservative lifetime record in Congress. We're the leftists. We're the, quote, sick puppies, which Donald Trump said yesterday when another Fox News interviewer said, Joe Scarborough said that you once said that you were going, that your people had said that they were going to go after Morning Joe. And instead of just playing the tape of Kash Patel saying that, and Steve Bannon saying that, giving him that evidence, again, it's smoke and mirrors. So, again, I'm concerned about this because it's shameful and it doesn't call out authoritarian language, Mika, but make no mistake, the pace is quickening, and there is a reason he is saying every day, Democrats are the enemy within. Democrats are the enemy within. Pelosi and Schiff and all of these people. This is, they know. Everybody knows.
The first time
this is unprecedented.
The first time around, it was the abortion meme, and we'll get to that, how that actually parallels perfectly. Ann Applebaum has a piece coming out in The Atlantic this week. We're going to have her on later this week, which will be good. And I want to make that parallel in just a moment and go to Claire. But first, let's show you the latest comments. Here's former President Donald Trump standing by his claim that certain Democrats are enemies from within, again, specifically attacking Congressman Adam Schiff and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Take a look at what he had to say on Fox News yesterday and later during a podcast interview.
The outside people, the so-called enemies, if they're enemies, and they might not be enemies, if you have a smart president, they can be handled. But when you have people investigating my campaign, when you have people, you know, they spied on my campaign now. You understand that. That's been proven. But they spy on your campaign. The Russia hoax was all made up, and now it's acknowledged that it was made up. All of these different things. You have the 51 different agents saying it was from Russia, and now they all say it wasn't from Russia. Okay, so we were lying. Many other things, many. I could go order. You just don't have enough time. But what they've done is so terrible. Who's ever heard of anything like this? Adam Shifty Schiff, he's a crooked guy. He's a crooked politician, 100%. And he's going to be a senator now. Can you believe it?
But again, he's a political opponent of yours.
He's not.
An enemy.
No, he's a. Well, of course, he's an enemy. He's an enemy. These are bad people. We have a lot of bad people. But when you look at Shifty Schiff and some of the others, yeah, they are, to me, the enemy from within. I think Nancy Pelosi is an enemy from within. She lied. She was supposed to protect the Capitol. If we have to protect our country, and maybe we should let the other side, I don't even call them the enemy. I think we have more of an enemy from within than we do from outside. You know, if you have a smart president, they talk about China and Russia and everything else. If you have a smart president, they're not going to be the problem. We have a bigger problem from within, and they hate it. I noticed today they were saying, he said the enemy from within. Of course it's Adam Schiff. These are bad people. These are sick people and bad people.
Harris is touting her conservative support, campaigning with Liz Cheney in 3 of the states I mentioned, PA, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
Well, I think that in this election, and especially here in Pennsylvania, we have the opportunity to tell the whole world who we are. And we have the chance to say, you know, we're going to reject cruelty. We're going to reject the kind of vile vitriol that we've seen from Donald Trump.
I have said many times publicly, and I'll say it again, in many, many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man. But the consequences of him being president of the United States are brutally serious.
That's the tag team closing. They also hammered the high stakes.
I know how quickly democracies can unravel. And I know that as Americans, we can become accustomed to thinking, well, we don't have to worry about that here. But I tell you, again, as someone who has seen firsthand how quickly it can happen, that is what's on the ballot.
We have in our grasp the ability to determine the course of our country. You know, every election we've said this is the one. This is the one. This truly is the one.
This is the one. And you could see we've actually heard both candidates talk about that. Both sides talk about this is so important. And hey, I know you've heard of that before, but it really is. The reasons they share, of course, are different. Now, Trump has had a far longer period of time to build his team and ground game. He's been more or less running for years since he lost his campaign in 20 and also lost an effort to steal it through the disruption of the peaceful transfer of power. So in that sense, he's got a lead on time. But Harris has a huge lead on the money game. Now, she's been raising money for a much shorter amount of time, but she's set records now for the biggest fundraising quarter ever, as the Times reports there. This quarter, as you see, raised $1 billion. That is just bananas. It speaks both to the unusual nature of her candidacy starting late, but there are plenty of late starters who wouldn't raise that kind of money. So it also shows an incredible unifying and enthusiastic mood across the Democratic Party, from grassroots donors to the big rich ones. Harris is getting a boost from big figures like Stevie Wonder in Georgia and Usher, coming off the Super Bowl, which is a reminder of his reach. Nobody does the Super Bowl halftime show without having huge reach in and beyond the U.S. He is helping her out in Atlanta, while Lizzo backs Harris in her native Detroit.
I'm proud to say that I voted early, and I voted for Kamala Harris.
We have the opportunity to choose a new generation of leadership for our country.
They say if Kamala wins, then the whole country will be like Detroit. Okay? Proud like Detroit. Resilient like Detroit.
We got work to do, Atlanta. ATL, we got work to do.
We're talking about the same Detroit that innovated the auto industry and the music industry. So put some respect on Detroit's name.
We ready. We... What? Oh!
That's some of the energy there. And we've seen some major figures coming out, as you see here in the home stretch, from the big stars to the star of the party, Barack Obama. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has shown more erratic signs in his behavior. He's gone on bizarre tangents. He has, of course, done some things that are quite serious with the authoritarian threats to abuse power against his opponents, against American citizens. He just says it out loud in public. And then things that are just strange. Trump spent over 10 minutes, it was counted, at a rally over the weekend discussing the golfer Arnold Palmer's genitals. It is the kind of oddity that is strange to discuss. If you heard about it or saw that rally and were talking to anyone about it in your life, at work or at home, you'd struggle to even describe it. But it could be misleading to just skip or over minimize what is happening. You could imagine if Joe Biden did such a 10-minute rant. NPR referred to the discussion of the golfing legend's, quote, manhood. Trump also used an obscenity to attack Harris, repeated the authoritarian language as I mentioned, casting American citizens as, quote, enemies. So we have the combination here of the Baroque and obscure, what Tim Walz calls weird, and the deadly serious. No one knows what's going to happen over these next 15 days on election night, but I can guarantee you one thing. If Donald Trump wins, he and his allies will point exactly to the things he's been saying over this weekend and the last few months as a kind of public justification or acceptance. Not that these were overwrought pieces of rhetoric or jokes. No, they'll say, he told you he was going to do this, and he won. And now he's going to do it. And no one can say they weren't told in advance. Now, even in that context, there are top Republicans who've openly defended Trump's efforts to do all sorts of bad things, including break the law and steal the election, who draw a line at Mussolini. They don't join in and say American citizens are enemies, enemies who should be fought with violence, like other actual foreign enemies in, say, North Korea or Russia, where we have a ground war that we're partly supporting. They don't go that far. But they won't honestly face what Trump said. Here is Speaker Mike Johnson lying, claiming that the enemy comment was only about, say, foreigners, not Americans, when Trump literally name-checked American lawmakers like Pelosi. And that's what makes this a lie. DOA.
That's not what he's talking about there. What he's talking about is marauding gangs of dangerous, violent people who are destroying public property.
We have a lot of bad people. But when you look at Shifty Schiff and some of the others, yeah, they are, to me, the enemy from within. I think Nancy Pelosi is an enemy from within.
There it is. How do you know what Trump means? Because he tells you what he means and he repeats it. And Speaker Johnson, who previously has been on this program and is welcome to come back, is lying. Full stop. Kamala Harris is speaking on Trump's erratic behavior, too.
When he does answer a question or speak at a rally, have you noticed he tends to go off script and ramble? And generally, for the life of him, cannot finish a thought. And he has called it the weave. But I think we here will call it nonsense.
Now, Harris has found better ways to deal with this, not the overreacting, pearl clutching, but still exposing it, still knowing that these are weaknesses for him, and often using what we saw there, a kind of a mocking joy mixed with what I also showed you tonight, which is her very serious warnings about the serious stuff. In any normal time, a person doing what Donald Trump is doing in public would be a very target-rich candidate indeed. But these are not normal times, in part because of him and in part because of larger factors we've explored. And so the question for the Democrats in the home stretch is, with so many targets, which are the best to focus on? And for Donald Trump, his aides are basically in a back and forth with him about whether to talk about someone's genitalia for 10 minutes or 8 minutes or 6 minutes. What's the right amount of time? How can you talk the boss out of at least going on so long like that? And how many times should he repeat, even when coaxed otherwise by his Fox News allies? No, he really means it. He means dictator. He means American enemies. He means abuse of power.
Well, I'm first of all going to say you're exactly right. Trump goes out and he says, I'm going to use the military to arrest my political enemies. Then the Mike Johnsons and the Lindsey Grahams and the Wall Street Journal, they just, oh, no, that's not what he really meant. Then he comes back and he says, yeah, that's exactly what I really meant. And you know what's going to happen? You correctly pointed it out. If he wins, he's going to say, I told people I was going to do this. I have the legitimacy of an election behind me. And you know what? He will have a point. Because if I do 5 interviews a day and answer 20 questions, 18 of them are going to be about polling. We've become a nation of polling analysts. And my point is, it's 48-48. He says, I'm going to get rid of the Constitution. I don't think we should get rid of the Constitution. Why don't you just go out and report what he's saying that he's going to do? And they keep saying he doesn't mean that. And he keeps saying, no, I mean that. I'm saying what I mean. And that point that you made, I think, is spot on. And people say, what's at stake in this election? Okay, the Constitution's at stake. The whole idea of I don't know, what do you call it, a constitutional republic, or, you know, whatever highbrow people call it. The idea that we live under a set of laws is literally at risk, and he's telling you that. And people want to know about weakness among males of color. Okay, you're going to arrest all of it. You don't think you have a stake in this election? Guess what? You're not going to do very well. I'm not going to do well. You're not going to do well. All right? When the paddy wagon comes, you and I are going to be in the back of it bouncing around. And it's not going to be very much fun. And they will tell you, the judge said, I'm sorry, Mr. Melba, I'm sorry, Mr. Carville. Mr. Trump said he was going to get rid of the Constitution. I have no choice but to enforce the democratic norms of this country. Maybe that'll happen. It's not far-fetched.
Well, I'm going to say it as clearly as I can based on the evidence. It's not far-fetched at all, because he got so far trying that in first term when he came off as a surprise who lost the actual total vote but won the Electoral College, and there were many more guardrails. But as you say, if people are looking up and all they're hearing about is cross-tab polling analysis, it actually minimizes, it diminishes the stakes, which are what you just said and the evidence I mentioned. He did go after people then. He did abuse foreign policy powers to try to get the Bidens investigated. He didn't succeed. Had he succeeded, there might have been so much smoke around the Biden crime family that you might have had a different nominee. He might not have, been beaten. Biden was obviously the one who emerged out of the Democratic process and then beat him. He went after Comey and McCabe. The number one and number two at the FBI were pursued. They both had tax audits. You think he's stopping at tax audits next time? He tried to get John Kerry. He tried to get John Kerry imprisoned. And all through that, there were a lot of guardrails that are diminished. So how do you say that, you talked about messaging, Mr. Messaging, to people who aren't following this as closely?
Say it succinctly, say it repeatedly, say it all the time. Because I think that Harris is going to win. Let me just say that up front. And I'm doubling down on that prediction, but could be wrong. So Trump wins, he does that.
I want to bring in NBC's Yamiche Alcindor, who is in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where the vice president was earlier today. Matthew Dowd was chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney campaign in 2004 and is an MSNBC senior political analyst. Meghan Hayes is former special assistant to President Biden and director of message planning. She was deputy communications director for President Biden's 2020 campaign. Great to have all of you here. So, look, Matthew, you've got all this money, all this information you've collected on all of these voters. How do campaigns combine all of that and put them to work in these final days?
Well, they have to decide first. They have that strategic decision that identifying a swing voter or an undecided voter at some point becomes a fool's errand. And I think at this point it is a fool's errand. And
really?
I think the vast majority of resources, 95% of resources in the campaign, my guess is it was in the Bush campaign in 2004, for the next 14 days or 15 days will be spent on motivating voters they know will vote for the vice president at this point. I think an undecided voter, if somebody says they're undecided voter today, and we saw this in 2000 and 2004, they're either not going to vote or they've already decided they're just not telling you. And so I think it's a waste of money and resources at this point to go after undecided voters. The better spend is on motivating voters she knows that are already with her.
So, Megyn, in that Times report, the political director of the Trump campaign talked about the undecided and said, these people are not super political, and so we're doing non-super political media. And I want to play what Donald Trump said in Pennsylvania about the late golfer, Arnold Palmer.
Arnold Palmer was all man, and I say that in all due respect to women, and I love women. But this is a guy that was all man. This man was strong and tough, and I refuse to say it, but when he took showers with the other pros, they came out of there, they said, oh my God. That's unbelievable.
No matter how many times you hear that, it still is a little bit unbelievable itself. But having said that, Megyn, and I'm not going to suggest that that is part of the campaign strategy. Arguably, there may be some people on his campaign who wish he would not say things like that. Having said that, I wonder if that is the kind of thing that breaks through, that might appeal to people who have been voting for Donald Trump or voted for Donald Trump back in 2016, because he is not, to say the least, your typical politician.
Yeah, if you look behind him, you see all the men in the back just totally laughing. So I think that that's who he is appealing to, right? He's trying to appeal to his base. He's trying to appeal to men. He's trying to appeal to things on social media and people who are getting their news solely on social media. So I do think it's part of a campaign strategy. I think that he likes this sort of obnoxious conversation that's shocking to people, that's not in the norm of what you think are politicians, so to speak, when they're out on the campaign trail this late. And I think that this is trying to get his base out, because this is going to be an election about his base turning out. I think when the vice president's trying to build a contrast, not only is she trying to get undecided voters to vote for her, she's trying to give his base a reason to stay home. And so, you know, they're both sort of saying the same thing. She's trying to build the contrast about what's presidential, and he's trying to motivate them to turn out.
There is no doubt, Yamiche, that certainly the Harris campaign is doing exactly what Matthew said, which is, how do we get these folks out there who support us to vote? Today is the last day to register where you are in Pennsylvania. So what's the strategy on the ground there to get these voters to the polls and maybe get some of these undecideds to actually register, people who maybe were not so engaged, were not necessarily planning to vote?
Well, Harris campaign officials tell me that the strategy is that they really want to get out the vote and be everywhere at all times. So that's why you have the vice president going to, of course, first Pennsylvania, then she's going to be going to Michigan, then she's going to Wisconsin to really go and talk to voters face to face directly. She just wrapped up this interview, or this really moderated conversation with Vice President, with Liz Cheney, the vice president did. And what you saw was really her taking questions from the audience, talking directly about what she sees as the danger and the threat of a former President Trump being elected. It was interesting because part of what she's doing here is to try to bring people who are really where the message of Republicans is really resonating, the idea that you might not agree with all of her policies, but that you want to back her because you're really seeing her as someone who will defend the Constitution. And I just wrapped up an interview with a voter who, remarkably, someone, you don't really get this that often, a voter who told me he was convinced while he was sitting there to vote for Vice President Harris. He was an African-American man, 42 years old, who said he came here because he had never been to a political rally. He watched her. He said that she answered questions very specifically, and as a result, he will now be voting for Vice President Harris. He's a registered independent who had been voting Democrat in the past, but he said this year he was really thinking about the Republicans, especially because of the economy, and he was convinced because of the answers that she gave that he will now be voting for her. So it's those kind of events that the Harris campaign is hoping will do that for all sorts of voters across this country. And when it comes to sort of how are they going to be trying to get people to the polls, they are having an operation, they tell me, that is really dwarfing, they believe, the size of the Trump campaign. So they have all sorts of field offices and staffers, including staffers who worked for former President Obama, who are specifically focused on Pennsylvania to make sure people have a real plan to vote. So they're really trying to make sure that not only people support her, but then have a specific way that they're going to be getting to the polls, whether that's early voting, whether that's making sure that they have plans with their neighbors and their friends. So it's all sort of this holistic view, they would say, the Harris campaign would say, is the way that they're trying to get out the vote in these last few days with 15 days to go. Chris.
Yamiche Alcindor, who found that unicorn, somebody who in the closing weeks of the campaign decided who they were going to vote for because of an event. Thank you very much for that, Yamiche. You know, Megyn, the Harris campaign has very clearly decided Liz Cheney is key to reaching at least some of the voters they need. And apparently, President Biden, at least in tandem with her, is not. The campaign, White House officials tell NBC there are no plans to campaign with him in these final 15 days. Do you think that's smart, especially considering Biden's close ties in a state like Pennsylvania?
I think it's a strategic decision to get your surrogates to spread out and to fan out across all the battleground states. You know, the president's traveling to New Hampshire tomorrow to talk about prescription drugs, so lowering of prescription drug costs, and then he's traveling to Arizona. So I think he's hitting strategic media markets, and he is talking.
Are you suggesting that this is not a strategic decision for her not to stand with him?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, you haven't seen her stand with Obama either in the last couple of weeks, and I don't think that they're planning on campaigning together or with Michelle Obama. You know, this is an opportunity to hit a lot of media markets. She is very fortunate, unlike President Trump, to have a lot of people who are backing her and a lot of surrogates out on the trail for her. And I think that that's an important thing to get to cover media markets and to be out there. As everyone knows, local media is where a lot of people and a lot of undecided voters are getting their news and their nightly news when they're cooking dinner for their family. So it's important to be there. And I think the Democrats showing up for her right now is what's important. So I don't necessarily think they need to be standing by. I just don't think that that's a necessity at this point.
And Matthew, I have to ask you about Donald Trump trolling Kamala Harris with these baseless claims that she never worked at McDonald's. He put on an apron, he salted the fries, and pardon the pun, peppered in the insults. Take a listen.
It was a big part of her resume that she worked at McDonald's, how tough a job it was. She specifically worked at the French fry, where they make the French fries, and she talked about the heat. It was so tough. She never worked at McDonald's. McDonald's just confirmed that again, by the way. She never worked at McDonald's. In other words, she's lying, Kamala.
A Harris spokesperson responded by saying, when Trump feels desperate, all he knows how to do is lie. He can't understand what it's like to have a summer job because he was handed millions on a silver platter only to blow it. On the other hand, there are other people who I've heard say, you know what, it makes him seem more approachable. He was kind of funny in that. What do you think that accomplished, if anything?
I think it makes him look like a clown, actually. I mean, first of all, he lies throughout of it, so I guess he gave a side order of lies in the course of whatever he was serving up. The other thing is it was a complete dad joke. I mean, it was a total made-up stop. They shut the McDonald's down, and then they had supporters practice going through the drive-through. So it wasn't even a day that the McDonald's was open for business. So he was in there in this faux sort of shtick that he does. I don't think it was smart of him. I think he should be wanting to talk about the economy and inflation and the border and crime. And here he is, dressed up in his red tie and white shirt at a McDonald's that was shut down for him on purpose. And so I actually don't think it's smart. I think it's stupid strategically for him, because he should be talking about issues that he has an advantage on, not doing this shtick at McDonald's.
Megyn, I saw you said that McDonald's was a humanizing moment for Trump. It has been trending on Twitter. Do you think it helps him?
So I said he threw some salt over his shoulder, and because he's superstitious, that was the humanizing moment. I actually think that going to a McDonald's that was closed down is a campaign stunt. I think that politicians do local stops all of the time, and they interact with people who are there, who are ordering food, if it's an ice cream shop or a deli or something, and the employees. I think that this is another moment that he is wasting not talking about the issues and not talking about the economy. And I just think that he only did this to jab the vice president, and pointing out that she came from a middle class background and understands people who are going through struggles in their economic outlook right now. I think only humanizes the vice president. So I think I think that this stunt it's successful because it's being played in the media, but again, it's playing to his base, not to the undecided voters who really matter.
So far, 14 million people have already voted early as Americans in 8 more states started to cast their ballots today. Joining us now, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, who is at the moment on Highway 45 in Texas on his way to an event for Senator Ted Cruz. You just spoke to Congressman Colin Allred, who wants to replace Senator Ted Cruz. Tell us about the state of that race and the state of early voting.
Yeah, this is the first day of early voting in Texas, Katie. It comes just a little more than 2 weeks before Election Day. And we saw huge lines at the polling location that we went to just outside Dallas. And the poll workers there were even surprised at the volume and consistency of those long lines. It wasn't as if they were just dealing with an early morning rush or a lunch rush. The lines were long consistently the entire time. Now, that's probably because it was the first day and people were anxious to get out and cast their ballot. In fact, Colin Allred, who you mentioned, is challenging the incumbent Ted Cruz in that race for Senate, was among those casting his ballot today. And these voters that we talked to who were in line today say that they're anxious to make sure their vote is heard, and that in this year in particular, they believe that there is a lot at stake. Take a listen to what some of them told us.
In general, Texas has not been super competitive at the national level.
No.
Yeah. Do you feel like this year it could be different?
I hope so. I've done some volunteering and I've talked to some people and found that more people are activated this time around.
Do you feel like people are really engaged? Are people talking about the election a lot? Do you find when you're at church or at work or at school, or are people sick of it? Are they ready for it to be over with?
I think people
all
are.
the above.
Yeah.
I think they're sick of it and they're talking about it.
Yeah.
True.
And that was pretty consistent with all of the voters that we talked to today. And that Senate race in particular is drawing a lot of attention. For a long time, Democrats have felt that they could turn Texas blue. They're not really competing at the presidential level here, but there have been tens of millions of dollars that have flooded into the state as part of this competitive Senate race, including an injection of cash from the Senate Majority PAC, which is a Democratic-leaning super PAC that's going to throw multi-million dollars into this race in the 11th hour. It would still probably be a surprise if Colin Allred were to win, Katie, but it's one of the only opportunities that Democrats have to pick up a seat in a map that is very difficult for them if they want to hold on to the majority in the United States Senate. Katie.
All right, Ryan Nobles, thank you very much. Joining us now, senior editor and elections analyst with the Cook Political Report, Dave Wasserman. Can we focus on Texas for just a moment? It's going to be a case study, I feel like, going forward because of the incredibly strict abortion laws in that state. And we just saw with that graphic that more women have so far voted. 50% of the vote is Democrat. The other, 43% is Republican, with 7% unaffiliated, it appears from that graphic I was watching. Do you think Texas is actually in play? Could it be a case study going forward?
Well, first of all, Katie, it's
hazardous to read anything into early voting data because we don't know who these people are voting for, and it doesn't tell us anything about what the nature of the final electorate will be once Election Day votes are cast. But Texas is a legitimately competitive Senate race because Ted Cruz is a uniquely polarizing figure who went to Cancun in 2021, and Colin Allred is raising just about as much money as Beto did 6 years ago. Cruz is raising more than he did 6 years ago. Ultimately, the difficulty for Allred is that we're not seeing the levels of support among Hispanic voters, particularly in South Texas or along the border in some of these polls that Democrats would need. And to win statewide, which Democrats haven't done since 1994, they need everything to go right.
All right. What about the rest of the country? Almost all of the states are early voting right now. Are there any indicators that you can suss out 2 weeks away?
Well, the only indicator from these record-breaking early voting turnout data is that among the people who are paying closest attention to this election, it's like a new iPhone going on sale. People cannot wait to get to the polls. But when we're looking at surveys in these 7 battleground states, you know, the polling is so tight that polls aren't precise enough to really be able to tell us who's ahead. And the one commonality is that neither Trump nor Harris is at 50% in the averages in any of these 7 states, which begs the question, who the heck are these undecided people who still cannot make up their minds 2 weeks out from Election Day? And in our research, what we know is that they skew younger, they skew a little bit more diverse, and they skew a little bit more female than the rest of the electorate. But they are also less college educated. They're overwhelmingly independents. And they hold very negative views of both candidates. And in our last battleground survey, 68% of them say they view Kamala Harris as too liberal to govern the country effectively. 70% of them say that Trump is too erratic and out of control to govern the country effectively. The warning sign for Harris, though, is that by 55 to 26, they trust Trump more than Harris to bring inflation under control, which means that her closing argument as the prosecutor in this race has to be about the economy and creating what she calls the opportunity economy more than, let's say, Liz Cheney and democracy arguments for the sake of winning those voters.
Really interesting point. Dave Wasserman. Dave, thank you very much.
A big legal debate right now over billionaire Elon Musk handing out million-dollar checks via his pro-Trump super PAC to one random American every day until November 5th. The catch? You've got to be a registered voter in a key swing state and sign his conservative-leaning online petition.
And all you have to do is sign a petition in support of the Constitution. It's very straightforward. You don't even have to vote. You don't have to vote. You just have to sign a petition saying you believe in the Constitution, which if you already believe in the Constitution, you're just signing something you already believe, and you can win $1 million. That's awesome.
But the big bucks giveaway is, as the New York Times puts it, quote, testing the bounds of election law. I want to bring in Professor of Law and Political Science at UCLA Law School, Rick Hasen. He is also an NBC election law analyst. It's good to see you. Fair to say we've never seen anything quite like this before. Is there anything legally that says Musk can't do this or shouldn't do this?
Right. So there are federal laws that apply anytime there's a federal candidate on the ballot, which is what we have coming up in November, that say that you can't pay anyone to register to vote or to vote. And so what essentially he's doing is he's setting up a lottery, and the only people who can participate are people who are registered to vote. So it's actually either creating an incentive for people to register to vote or a reward for them having already registered to vote. And it's clear that this violates the statute. And the Department of Justice has an election crimes manual that specifically mentions lotteries as an impermissible basis on which to get people to register or to vote.
So, Rick, a former chair of the Federal Election Commission told the Times that because Musk isn't directly paying people to register, but instead paying them to sign a petition, even if it's only open to registered voters, he, quote, comes out okay here. I mean, you even heard Musk telling the crowd in Pennsylvania there that they don't even have to vote. He says, in fact, that twice. So I just wonder what you think the case might be. Is it strong enough that somebody might bring it?
Well, first of all, if you want to sign the petition, you go to sign the petition, you look at what the eligibility is, and also this is the eligibility to get those $100 payments from Musk. It says you must be a registered voter in a swing state. So imagine we have a contest. We say anyone can win $1 million if they wear a pair of glasses, but they also have to be a registered voter. Well, the glasses is just kind of a make-weight. You're really saying we're going to give you a chance to win if you register to vote. This is a federal law. It would be enforced by the United States Department of Justice. I don't expect we'd see anything before the election. DOJ moves very slowly on their criminal prosecutions, but nothing would stop DOJ from putting out a notice saying that this kind of contest is illegal, just like DOJ recently put out a notice saying that states can't have wholesale purges of voters in the 90 days before the election because that violates federal law.
So, of course, rich people giving money to campaigns in one way or another is nothing new, right? But I wonder if you look at a big picture, if there are laws that need to be considered here. We're in a place we've never seen before. First of all, a lot more billionaires than they have ever been, very publicly influential. Musk, for example, not only has money to burn, but he has X, formerly Twitter. Trump has said he'd make a new cabinet position for Musk if he's elected. So I wonder, are there laws out there? Do laws need to change because of the kind of changing influence we're seeing from people with deep pockets?
So to be clear, under current law, it's unconstitutional, thanks to the Supreme Court, to limit spending in elections. The Supreme Court decided that in 1976. They reaffirmed that in the Citizens United case in 2010. Congress tried to pass laws limiting spending by the ultra-rich in elections, and the Supreme Court said that that's a violation of the First Amendment. So all the other things that Musk is doing, his work with X, his giving the money to the super PAC, those are all considered legal under current system. And then the question is, do we want to think about amending the Constitution to change the role of the ultra wealthy? But that's really very different than what Musk is doing with this lottery, which seems to be a clear violation of federal law.
Rick Hasen, thank you so much.